All right, team, let's bring it home. So we're looking at the consequences of inflation being too high or too low in relation to the goal of price stability. There's a little bit more going on here relative to the other two goals. So do make sure you listen in and that they make sense to you, and always keep one eye on living standards in terms of either it being an impact to material or non-material living standards. As I've said in previous videos, the easiest way to do that is to derive some kind of argument about changes to access to goods and services to angle into that material living standards argument. So the first consequence, if inflation is too high, is obviously the erosion of purchasing power. So if your wages are here and inflation's here and inflation starts to rise and unfortunately your wages don't keep up, then you're going to experience a decrease in your purchasing power, and ultimately that's going to decrease your access to goods and services. So not a great outcome. The other one is the wage price spiral. So if inflation is too high, what we start to see is sort of industrial sort of relations turning towards a point where workers are going to start to demand higher wages. So as we've seen at the moment, there's a high cost of living. There's lots of situations where sort of contracts and enterprise bargaining is going such that people are demanding higher wages. Have a look at the ambulance sector in Victoria, for example, and see the reasons why they've been on strike. More to the point as well is the latest ones with the V line and the metro train disruptions due to some union activity there, obviously demanding higher wages. So when these higher wages are paid, it represents an increase in the cost of production for the producer. So imagine your graph for a minute, your aggregate supply, aggregate demand. You're going to shift aggregate supply to the left, and that's going to cause inflation to go up again. And then we see demand for higher wages. And so eventually that gets paid through, and that leads to the increase in the cost of production again. And so we call this a wage price spiral, because if it's not managed correctly by the government or the Reserve Bank, ultimately it's a bit of a cycle, and you see that increase in wages followed by inflation, wages, inflation. So they call it the wage price spiral. The third one is the distortion of spending and investment decisions. So if consumers and businesses expect that prices are going to continue to rise, we're going to see an increase in the demand for goods and services right now. So I guess a more recent example of that is the COVID years. So when COVID started, there was a lot of panic and there was a lot of panic buying. The reason being is that people expected, obviously, prices to explode if there was going to be a huge shortage of these particular products. So it generally tends to relate to essential goods and services. So if we see a massive increase in the demand for goods and services right now because future expectations dictate people think that prices are going to go up, it's going to put more pressure on aggregate demand. So an increase in C and possibly I, but mostly C, and then plug that through the equation, draw the graph, that leads to even more inflation. So, high inflation creating even more inflationary pressures under the climate. So again, there needs to be some kind of intervention to stem that expectation. So there's two more in relation to consequences being too high. There's lower returns on investment. So you'll learn about this more in Unit 4, but if there's high inflation, we need to somehow see a decrease in aggregate demand to bring that inflationary pressure down. And that's usually coupled with an increase in the interest rate. So if you go back to interest rate as a factor for a moment, increase in interest rates makes it obviously more expensive to access credit. It also means those individuals and businesses that have loans now face higher interest repayments. Both those things are going to decrease aggregate demand and shift the curve to the left, okay? So if you're an investor, it's now going to be more expensive for you to access credit and conduct investment purchases. So there's going to be lower returns for investments into the long run. And that might potentially be a disincentive to invest. And that could obviously wreak havoc on the economy as well. And then another one that is pretty obvious, probably a really tidy one to speak to, is this loss of international competitiveness. So if you imagine Australia's inflation rate is increasing at a faster rate compared to other countries, our products are going to be more expensive compared to other countries. So if you're overseas looking to make a purchase and you look at Australia and see that their goods and services are more expensive relative to the rest of the world, we're going to lose our competitive edge in those markets, and potentially we're going to see a decrease in our exports. Which, if you think about those individual industries, isn't going to be great for the people that are employed in that industry as businesses suffer a decrease in their profits. So once again, team, I've put the link to living standards question mark here, constantly trying to think, okay, well, how is it going to potentially impact people's incomes, therefore access to goods and services, therefore material living standards? They're the most obvious connections, I think, but obviously there's going to be some there for non-material living standards as well. Okay, and then the last piece is the consequences if inflation is too low. So you might think, all right, well, if inflation goes down, that's a good thing, means that prices are falling or the rate of increase is less, and that's only going to be a good thing. But remember, the goal is 2 to 3%. So we're talking about anything under 2% here. So the first one is delayed consumption. So if I expect that prices will continue to fall into the future, I'm not going to buy goods and services now. I'm going to wait, okay? And so if I begin to wait, that's going to decrease consumption spending, and that's going to reduce aggregate demand even further. And so obviously that's going to continue to put downward pressure on prices and exacerbate this issue, but it makes it more difficult to achieve other goals. So if you shift aggregate demand to the left, have a look at the outcome on the x-axis in terms of economic growth and employment, and you'll start to run into issues there such that those goals are more difficult to achieve. And then an offshoot of that is basically a potential increase in unemployment. So if inflation continues to fall and we continue to delay our consumption spending and decrease output, we're going to see a decrease in the demand for labour resources. So that's going to lead to an increase in cyclical unemployment, until we're able to sort of stimulate aggregate demand again and see a correction in the market. So both these things work really well in terms of reducing access to goods and services. So therefore that link to material living standards is just sort of sitting there for you nicely once more. I've stolen this from my other slides. You know the drill by this stage. We need to speak to 2 consequences of not achieving the domestic macroeconomic goal of, in this case, price stability. So I've just tweaked the question. Be aware that it could be asked, the same question in relation to any of the goals. And just like the others, you need to come in and define your goals. So once again, making sure that, you've got those definitions nice and tidy. And then you want to explain the first consequence and get into a little bit of detail. And then the second consequence and then the detail that's required. Keep in mind this question could have easily included and living standards, so then you would need to make that secondary link in each argument to either material or non-material living standards. And that's it for content, team. Best of luck.